So, so happy to introduce Castillo and Elizabeth. First of all, let me say that this is our second seminar, and starting October 7th is going to be a weekly series. I'm so excited about that. We're lining up 10 awesome people, and so it'll be once a week. And it will alternate between 2 times on Friday, noon and 6 p.m. Eastern US time, so to accommodate schedules and time zones. And the format that we're piloting basically is to combine the seminars with these discussion groups and a 30-minute exclusive Q&A with the discussion groups. And so it's just a really nice development that we'll be having one of these every a week as a way also to grow the ProSocial Commons and ProSocial world. So Elizabeth, you're at Arizona State University. Please remind me of the department that you're at.
The Faculty of Leadership and Interdisciplinary Studies.
Okay. And ASU, for those who don't know, is just an amazing university. I'm at the forefront of transdisciplinary studies, thanks in large part to its president, Michael Crow. It's also a powerhouse for evolutionary studies, one of the greatest centers in the world, which isn't to say that it's so easy to coordinate everyone and so on. But in any case, Elizabeth has been involved with, you've been involved with the ProSocial world and history of life for quite a long time, really a great contributor. And I think that I'm really looking forward to your talk on nonprofits and accounting for values. And so let's just begin. And there'll be a Q&A for everyone. And then afterwards, and then, now this is a small enough group, so actually anyone who wants to hang out for the extended discussion is welcome to do so. So Elizabeth, please take it away.
Great. Can you all see my screen now?
Yep.
Great. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here. To give you some background, what I wanted to investigate is this dynamic called the nonprofit starvation cycle. So I worked for many years in nonprofit organizations, and I was a fundraiser, and I got tired of our merit of our organization being judged on what our efficiency rate was. So the lower the better, 10 to 15%. If you're more than that, you're deemed an inefficient organization and it's hard to get funding. And that just seemed like nonsense to me. So I wanted to dig into this problem. I knew capacity building was part of the solution, but it wasn't very systematic. So I started to dig into that. And where it took me, this puzzle was really honing in on efficiency. And so it occurred to me, do I really even know what efficiency is? So I started digging into the literature. And it turns out the basic understanding, or the conventional understanding of efficiency, is economic efficiency, which has 3 aspects: productive efficiency, allocative efficiency, and then static efficiency, which is a combination of the first 2. And it's really looking at minimizing costs at a moment in time. So at a static thing. But as I dug deeper into the literature, I found, well, there's actually a couple other types of efficiency that really don't get much love. And one of them is dynamic efficiency. And so this is the idea that increasing the long-term productive capacity of a system over time through processes such as research and development and innovation. And then also distributive efficiency, which is optimizing equitable distribution of social benefits. So getting resources to where they need to go at the moment they're needed. And the case study I decided to investigate was a place where I used to work in San Diego called the Balboa Park Cultural Partnership. It's a consortium of, at the time, 29 arts and culture organizations, and they did give their permission to be named in this study publicly. And I chose them because they did something that is quite remarkable in the world of collaboration. They formally incorporated to create their own standalone organization. But over a 15-year period from 2000 to 2015, they were able to find a sustainable business model. And so I was curious, like, what is the story? How did that come to be? Because it's very rare for any type of nonprofit organization to be able to generate that kind of financial resources consistently, let alone a network collaboration. And what's important to know about the Balboa Park cultural partnership is their member organizations came in all sizes. So the largest being the San Diego Zoo. They were really the big gorilla in the group, 225 million budget. But then we had really specialized members as well. So the Centro Cultural de la Raza and the World Beach Center, they had less than $100,000 budgets. And but they all shared the same park space. Each was managed by its own board of directors, and they were individually incorporated nonprofits. The formal collaboration started in 1999 due to a crisis, which we'll talk more about. The city of San Diego owns the buildings that the organizations occupy, and they lease them for $1 a year from the city, so a public-private partnership. And the way the partnership was able to create a sustainable business model was by creating a collaborative membership program where people could purchase one membership that would get them into all the museums. That had been talked about for years, but because of territoriality, it never manifested until 2014. So we'll talk about that a bit more too. The data sources that I used, it was mixed methods, so qualitative and quantitative, looking at a lot of documents, both at the partnership and individual member organizations. I looked at all their tax returns, and then I did interviews with 16 people, mostly executive directors, but some funders and some staff people as well. And then through all that data, I sifted through to do process tracing to tell a story over time for how this sustainable business model came into being, and then thematic coding of the data. And the research question I was interested in is how did a formal collaboration of nonprofit arts and culture organizations create a sustainable business model? And as you can see here in the circles, in terms of revenue, their first tax filings were in 2005. At that time, the revenue was $270,000. And by 2015, they had over $5 million. So that was a strong track record of growth. And then importantly, it wasn't just all gobbled up by expenses. They were able to generate net surplus reliably by 2015. They did have some ups and downs along the way, some cash flow issues. So if you ask the organizations, how did they describe their work? They would tell you they did it in terms of programs. So their sustainability program, their Learning Institute program, but that's not really an explanation. It's more from a managerial point. So I was curious, what is the explanation for how this happened? And the analytic framework through which I analyzed the data were two things. One, I started looking at nature as a model for how do resources flow across trophic levels in food webs. And I came across the work of Latka and Odom, who talk about this notion of flux and maximum power. I'll get into that in a little bit more. But the other framework I looked at, more from an economic standpoint, was this notion of multiple capitals. And I'll explain why I chose that framework as well. So getting to the trophic levels, resource flows, it came into, what is your unit of analysis? And so what I liked about this model is it really looked at the system, resource flows across organisms, species, and the ecosystem. And it also looked at units in time. So more of a dynamic efficiency perspective for the long term, which is what's required for a sustainable business model. And then also this notion of generativity. So it wasn't just about selection and adaptation, but the ability to produce, generative cooperative surplus in this case, as we'll see. And then Odom took Lotka's work and refined it further, talking about, this difference between power versus efficiency. So instead of just static efficiency at maximizing efficiency at a moment in time, what does it look like from a dynamic perspective over time? And he became interested in this problem because his initial research showed nature was not very efficient. Sometimes only 10% of resources flows or energy made it to the next level of the trophic. And he said, that seems like not very efficient. What's going on here? And we'll dive into what he found a little bit later, but it turns out that it is this notion of dynamic efficiency over time. The other analytic framework I looked at was multiple capitals. Part of this, because of the historic recognition of its generative capacity, we all know Adam Smith and Marx's work on capital. But increasingly in the business literature, there's recognition of the importance of intangible assets. And some recent research shows that up to 90% of firms' value is now generated through intangible assets, such as brand, reputation, and intellectual property as a few examples. And the explanatory power I saw potentially in this was this notion of non-rivalrous and non-excludable. And what these two terms mean, it's think about a lighthouse. So the light it gives off, somebody using that light, it doesn't make any less light for anyone else, right? So that's the non-rivalrous. And the non-excludable means that, by somebody using it, it doesn't leave less for others. So, and then I went to Carl Polanyi. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he has an excellent book, The Great Transformation, and he really mapped out the history of capitalism, starting back in the 1500s, and looking at this notion of social embeddedness. And his argument was that you cannot understand a financial system in isolation. You have to look at the context in which it's embedded, particularly the relational structures that guide them. And as property became privatized, people had less options and it eroded social capital. So I started looking at the literature to take embeddedness a little bit further. What are all the parts of a system that are embedded in each other, beginning, of course, with the financial and manufactured that show up on a balance sheet, but also thinking about humans, relationals, the structures that we create through our organizing, the symbolic, which is kind of the cultural and the meaning that we make out of things. And then, of course, nature, which is the source of all other resources. And then Bronfenbrenner added this notion of time, is that you have to understand the dynamics of a system over time. From that, I developed a multiple capitals typology that has different categories of capital: financial, natural, human, relational, symbolic, and structural. One of the things that my model gets criticized for is why so many types of capital. People feel it's a bit overwhelming. I really came out of this from a practitioner standpoint and from a manager standpoint, like as far as what's in my toolbox that I can work with in order to, generate sustainable profitability. And these were the tools that I came up with. And an important thing also to know about this typology, just like energy can be converted into different forms, capitals can also be converted. And we're going to see how in a few minutes. So I'll jump into some of the findings. Initially, one is that the partnership worked with what it had, the resources that were at its immediate disposal. In the entrepreneurship and business literature, this is called bricolage, making do with what you have on hand. They also activated latent resources, particularly building social capital and establishing norms of reciprocity, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then developing catalytic processes So process capital is one of the elements in my model of how do you, enact these capitals and do the resource flows, and processes are key to that. So here is a picture of Balboa Park and a timeline of the partnership's evolution. So in the 1990s, there were monthly meetings that different staff members would go to, but it was an information exchange only. There was no joint collective action. And then in 1999, a crisis hit. The city was going through some financial tough times, so they wanted to start charging the institution's market rate rent for the buildings they occupy. And that would have really put most of them out of business. They could not have afforded that. They were barely scratching by. And then there were some other issues like wanting to put in some commercial activities into the park, which went against the city charter of what the park's intention was. And so it dawned on people, well, hey, we better start talking to each other and working together if we're going to fight against this, these city initiatives. And so at first it was just a group of 6 executive directors. And mind you, these organizations had been there since the early 1900s, many of them, but they each did their own thing. And prior to this time, there just was no regular interaction by the leadership boards and directors. So the crisis brought them together finally. And so I see this as leveraging a latent resource. They always had spatial proximity. So spatial capital is one of the elements of my model. And then they could have been talking and working together, right? But they didn't until they absolutely needed to. So, turning social capital from a potential energy or potential resource into an activated resource. Another thing that was very important was this, how they structured themselves. So when they started to, decided to incorporate formally in 2001, they were very intentional about the creation of their bylaws. And one of the things that was on their mind was, how do we make it equitable when we have such different types of institutions and such different sizes of institution? And so 3 of their most important bylaw decisions were: 1, each agency or organization got 1 vote regardless of size. So everyone's vote counted equally. And this kept potential power imbalances in check. Another decision they made was that you were not allowed to send substitutes to the meetings. So the decision makers were always at the table, which meant work got done expeditiously instead of being delayed, as so often happens in collaborations. And then another choice they made was to prorate the dues based on the size of the budget. And this ensured equity and inclusion so that smaller organizations could participate on par with the bigger institutions. And then over time, what this network formation did was start attracting financial capital that none of them would have qualified for individually. So one of the funders I spoke to pointed out that the ability to attract large major grants, such as from Institute of Museum and Library Services and National Science Foundation, became a benefit of the collaboration. They wouldn't have qualified it also for the James Irvine Foundation. Then they started growing in 2004 as issues came up. They survived, they weathered that first crisis of the city. And then they said, well, what can we do now? We don't want to lose momentum. So they started looking at other issues that were affecting all of the organizations. One of them was parking. Parking is really bad on the weekends. And so they went into some inquiry and fact finding and data collection to see how they could help the city make better decisions about parking. They also started looking at educating, and they developed a learning institute ultimately, where the member institutions, their employees could be educated on things like visitor services, exhibit development, audience development, that kind of thing. Then they also looked at shared business operations, collective business operations, seeing how they could pool their resources. and to generate cost savings. And so in some ways, this came really successful. They were able to do group purchasing, for example, which lowered their costs. But where they were not able to gain traction in the shared business operations was in terms of centralizing like human resources. And the reason was that the organizations were operating on such thin margins, I mean, with no slack, that there really weren't any savings to be had because they weren't spending that much on it to begin with. The other things they looked at were marketing and PR, coordinating that, the shared governance, and then improving communication. And over time, as I mentioned, they ultimately were able to generate this shared business model or shared membership model that started generating a couple $1 million a year in revenue to sustain the collaboration. And so one of the findings also was the importance of process capital. So the ones I heard a lot in the interviews and also through the archival data was the importance of leadership, communications, being very intentional about it, connecting and convening regularly, repeated interactions over time were very important dynamic. Collecting data, fulfilling a need for the city of San Diego by aggregating data from the member institutions, learning where new practices and best practices and exhibits and visitor services, for example, were shared. And then, so that brings us to ProSocial strategy. So this was another thing. It turns out that their strategy is different than how typical businesses, that are focused on competitive advantage. The strategy of cooperative advantage entailed feeding two birds with one hand, which is the way I describe building multiple forms of capital simultaneously. And we'll see an example in a moment. Also activating agency at multiple levels, individual, organizational, and community, but in a way that allowed for self-organization and autonomy. So it was nothing prescribed from the top down. It was more they created a structure and scaffolding where people could figure out, individually what made sense for them and their needs. Through these activities, they were able to generate increasing returns, which is a term from economics that means gains that produce more gains. And this comes, the returns they generated were intellectual capital, reputational capital, political capital, and then also spiritual capital. They used Maslow's hierarchy of needs as a way to frame some of their visitor services educational programming to develop new approaches to engaging audiences. And then producing positive externalities, which are, benefits to the larger operating environment and community, but in a way that not only did it return benefits to the community, but some were able to recycle back into the organizations to become new inputs. And we'll talk about that towards the end of this presentation when we get into social accounting models. So this is a very granular view of how social capital and self-organization got going to get sustainability going at the Reuben H. Fleet Science Center. And it turns out that, a couple of their employees were super interested in sustainability and wanted to know, well, what could we be doing at our organization? So they reached out to the partnership and they got some resources. They started meeting monthly and deciding, well, what could we do here at the Fleet Museum? Through these brown bag meetings, monthly lunch meetings, they started coming up with ideas. Then they asked for some city resources. This was more intellectual capital, like learning about sustainability and what could be possible with HVAC systems and lighting, for example. Their first project was to do a waste audit to see what kind of trash was being thrown away and what percentage of that would be potentially recyclable. And over time, as they, gained traction with these projects, they ended up taking it into their exhibits and engaging the community to become part of the sustainability process. So this is an example of a grassroots process and how it was activated by mobilizing these multiple forms of capital. Ultimately, what this did, when you took it, not just the Fleet Science Center, but the practices spread throughout the park, they were able to generate over almost 9 million kilowatt hours of energy saved annually or cumulatively, and then which added up to $1.4 million in cost savings to the institutions, not to mention reduction in greenhouse gas emissions for the environment. And through this type of collective collaboration, they were able to transform that natural capital investment into reputational capital. They were named an Energy Showcase Grand Champion by the local energy or the regional energy provider. They were also starting to be asked to speak at LEED conferences and national sustainability conferences. It put them on the national funders' radar screens. And then the politicians, once they saw all this success, they started getting very interested and kind of wanting to claim credit for the success and having their press conferences there. And they became more willing to invest in Balboa Park. So I'll show an example of that in a minute. But here's one I thought David would be interested in, and this is how cultural norms were shifted through the process of learning, collaborative learning. So for many years, the organizations always saw each other as competitors. The mental model was, if a visitor goes to your organization, that means they won't come to mine. So it was kind of the scarcity mentality. And as they started learning together about audience development and visitor services, they started thinking, well, hey, maybe we could cross promote and develop creative exhibits where we would draw visitors to both of ours and make it more of a cross experience. And once that shift came on, they really no longer saw each other as competitors, much more as collaborators. And so they shifted from this competitive to cooperative advantage mindset. I will tell you the one place where we really were not able to shift that mindset was in the fundraising domain. The development officers, even though we tried to get them to collaborate, that was something we never succeeded at in a meaningful way. And so this is an example of how the growth in political capital from the city ultimately led to more financial capital. So a high-ranking city administrator I talked to who oversaw a lot of funding for the park noticed that the partnership became less fragmented, and they developed the ability to address policy and political issues. It was no longer whining about operational issues like why can't we get water pressure or what's going on with my building's services. They started talking more on policy level issues in a way that the city could hear and was interested in hearing. And then once they made that language shift, they started to see more money come in from the city. So one of the capital types I think I do need to add to my model is this notion of linguistic capital. So how you frame things, your narrative really shapes what's possible and what resources can come your way. Another finding was the importance of activating agency at multiple levels. So here we have one example of Sabrina, a pseudonym, how she started to connect with other people in comparable positions around the park. It helped her develop a sense of what was possible for her own position, and it gave her an outlet to grow. At the organizational level, one of the program evaluations found that organizations that both participated fully in the BPCP programs benefit, but even those that did not participate directly also benefited as people who had participated in the programs reached out to the non-participating institutions and developed cross collaborations that way. And then through the community, getting them engaged in sustainability initiatives such as LEED certification of the buildings and climate change action. So one of the key findings was this notion of action at different levels and how the resources flow across the macro, meso, and micro levels. And so here's sort of the model that I ended up with for the explanatory framework. And it's really thinking what we typically call capacity building in the nonprofit sector, thinking about it more in terms of capital building from a multiple capitals perspective. And so instead of just their programs, being what made all the magic happen, thinking about the programs as ways to develop social capital, intellectual capital, creative capital, and spiritual capital. Through those steps, they then were able to generate new forms of capital, especially political, reputational, cultural, through a sense of shared identity, and organizational. They generated a new sister organization for a technology collaboration. An important point here in this third column is that you could not manufacture any of those directly, right? They tried for years to get political capital through individual action. And it was only this emergent property of these forms of capital through the programmatic work, but the social, the intellectual, and the natural had to come first, and the creative. And then ultimately, what all these programs and new emerging capitals led to were huge cost savings, new funding sources, reduced carbon emissions, a new business model for shared patronage with 2.7 million in revenue in 2014-15. And it also increased the diversity of visitors and gave people pathways to engage more deeply with the partnership, and then embedding learning into the practices of all the institutions. And the positive externalities this produced were mission fulfillment, both for the BPCP and for its member institutions. But it also generated financial returns both for the partnership and also for its member institutions, who got a share of the shared revenue model from the shared membership program. So now I want to step more into like what are some of the explanations for what's making this possible. So I see this as, their structures enabled the fostering of generative capacity, the production of cooperative surplus through dynamic efficiency. So their indirect cost rate was a little bit high, like around 17%, but it was producing these long-term gains. And so thinking about efficiency a little bit differently from static to dynamic. And one of the models I really like comes from nature, this notion of interdependence as it's defined in biology, right? And so in biology, it's a process by which an organism increases its own fitness by improving the fitness of its operating environment. And one example is a tree. Even though its fallen leaves may seem like wasted energy or a wasted byproduct, the dead leaves are actually processed by microorganisms in the soil. And through that processing, that mutualistic processing, they become nutrients in the soil that support the future tree's growth. So the benefits return to the organism through this stored or delayed release of energy. And then in a resilience article, I found this resource flow model, which seemed to resonate, but the idea that working through these adaptive cycles of growth and then release, storing and activating, it mirrored how I saw the resource flows playing out in the cultural partnership. And then also, this being in tune with the operating environment in order to identify what was needed. So what was a service that the partnership could provide, such as the parking data for the city, and then building programs around that. And so through this mutual information exchange and attunement between the organization and its operating environment, it was able to, develop more robustly over time. And now getting to some new narratives, which I feel are much needed for economics. Instead of trickling down, which is sort of the dominant myth of economics, we could see it more in terms of spiraling up. And so the graphic on the right comes from an article on a study of rural development in Nebraska, where they talk about community capitals and how investments made the possible increasing returns. What I'm proposing then is using a framework of functional approach to organizing. And so I really like the notion of ecosystem services, which entails 4 categories. You can think of it as supporting, which is your substrate of civil society, for example, provisioning, the ability to provide needed resources, regulating, what is the regulatory macro environment that makes the ground rules for what is possible, and then cultural, so what are the norms and relational practices between them. And so through that framework, in one of my chapters, I developed this notion, we really can't think about capitalism. We talk about it like it's a singular thing, but maybe what we need to do is start thinking about it as a continuum. And so you can have antisocial, value extracting types of capitalism, and you can have more mutualistic types of capitalism that produce cooperative surplus. And so I identified, strategy or behaviors that organizations practice, such as strategy, what types of externality, what kinds of, wealth are they creating, and for whom, accountability, and looking at all of those along continuums. And then looking at nature as a model in terms of resource exchange as well. And so thinking about exchange in terms of parasitic, commensalistic, and mutualism. So parasitic, one organism would feed off another, doing harm to the other. And that's an argument that some people make about neoliberal forms of capitalism. And then you have transactional, instrumental. But if you get to mutualistic type of capitalism, and this is what I see conscious capitalism being very emblematic of, right, is not only do you create benefits for both organizations and the people participating, but you also enrich the ecosystem. So a consummate example from nature is pollination. As pollinators visit different flowers, both species benefit, but then it creates stronger biodiversity and resilience in the ecosystem. So core to this mutualistic approach to capitalism or resource exchange is reciprocity. And this is, both parties have to benefit if you're going to get them to engage in continued exchange. And extractive exchanges, practices such as suboptimal competition, such as a high interest payday loans is one example. It makes people less likely to exchange broadly. It erodes trust and it reduces social cohesion. And another myth I'd really like to get rid of is this notion of, transaction costs. So to me, it's quite amusing that Williams won the Nobel Prize the same year that Eleanor Ostrom did for the work he did on transaction costs. And what this said was, well, why do organizations arise anyways? And his explanation, which was widely heralded in the economics community, was because they reduce transaction costs. And these are things like searching for information, the bargaining and negotiation, and then enforcing contracts. And so organizations were seen as a solution to those problems. I argue that it's actually the production of cooperative surplus, which is why organizations arise across multiple levels. You can think of them as qualitative state changes, from individuals to organizations, and then, as we saw here, from organizations to a network or a formal collaboration. And these forms generate more increased opportunity for cooperative surplus. The thing I'm working on right now is to translate all this through the lens of evolutionary science, which I'm just starting to be a little conversant in, but looking at Tinbergen's 4 questions, which looks at both a slice in time, so the mechanisms for how does this resource exchange work, for example, and what functional value does it provide? And then how does that help a system persist over time and shape its developmental trajectory and the forms it takes? Future directions also is I want to look more into thermodynamics as a way to structure systems. And so Energy Flow in Biology, a book I came across, talks about the flow of energy through a system actually acts to organize that system. So I think that's a promising direction. And then I'm very interested in this notion of open-endedness, which at its heart is about novelty and reliably creating generative capacity. And so here I'm looking to the literature on evolutionary algorithms, artificial intelligence, and generative algorithms to show how as a potential model. And then also anti-fragility, which is more than just resilience. Resilience is bouncing back from a setback, but anti-fragile is the ability to actually improve and get better. And I'd also like to take a look at relational biology, this notion of anticipatory systems. And what this says is what our model of a system is actually, constrains or enables options. Getting to the anti-fragile piece, as I dug into it more, I think control and the central question, what do we do with variability, right? And so in many organizations, variability was seen as bad. Certainly in a production manufacturing, you can see why that might be, but even our mental models of scientific management and control, reducing variability, that really limits human creativity and motivation. So as people started becoming more aware of that, they got into this notion, well, maybe we can try to absorb variability, and that gets to things like diversity and also buffers and slack. And then in project management, you see changes such as agile project management, which is trying to build adaptation into the queue as a way to cope with variability. But if we want to get to anti-fragile, that's actually turning the variability into a resource. So it's important to realize that variability, we think of it as bad or dangerous, but actually there's also opportunity, embedded in variability. And so we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and capabilities development is one potential way for that. So the key takeaways here is to get to dynamic efficiency, you need an economy that's rooted in reciprocity, not value extraction. And to think about resources in a broader, with a broader lens, that they can be created endogenously by the organization itself. Converted from one form into another, like the partnership did, monetizing some of those as a way to develop financial returns, returning benefits across multiple levels in a way that increases long-term generative capacity of the system. Let's see. And so I want to maybe do a time check here and leave time for questions. I do have stuff on social accounting, but how are we doing? Oh, I think you're muted.
I think we're doing fine, Elizabeth, and I'm especially interested to hear what you have to say about social accounting. So how many more minutes would it be if you went through the social accounting?
Probably about 7 more minutes.
Well, I'm not the dictator here, but why don't you go for it?
Okay, great. Well, then let me get back up to my, let's see. And so where I'm very coming from a practitioner background. I'm as much as I love theory and it's very important. I think it's also important to like, how can these principles be enacted? And one of the major problems is that intangible resources, because they don't show up on financial accounting documents, they largely are invisible, and they also get underinvested in and are often actually seen as cost centers rather than developmental potential. And so I'm particularly interested in a type of social accounting called integrated reporting. And what it does is it looks at multiple forms of capital. It uses 6: financial, manufactured, intellectual, human, social, and natural, and shows how a business, through its business model, transforms those into outputs, outcomes, and impact, and ideally in a strategic way so that the outputs cycle back to become new inputs. So the good news is that social accounting is being taken up everywhere in the world, except sadly, the United States is a laggard. So the models I'm going to be looking at or sharing with you right now are from other parts of the world. But this is from an airport in the Netherlands called the Schiphol Airport. And they talk about multiple forms of capital, how they transform those into value for the firm and its stakeholders, and the metrics that they use to track each of those. So that's an example of what's possible. And then they also tie it to the Sustainable Development Goals for the macro global viewpoint. And then here's an example of the metrics. I won't go into them now, but I'll share the slide deck with everyone so you can refer to them later. Similarly, Ernst & Young, which is a global accounting firm, their Japanese branch uses a multiple capitals model to talk about human, social, and intellectual capitals, how their business models and engagement with stakeholders transform those into value for the firm and for the stakeholders. And then here's some of the metrics that they use, talking about things like client value, people value, social value, and financial value. And then even the Japanese stock exchange is using this multiple capitals model. So Japan is one of the front runners. Integrated reporting was born in South Africa, and it's required for firms that trade on the stock market in South Africa. Japan is highly recommending that its publicly traded organizations adopt integrated reporting. There's a lot of changes in the ESG, environmental, social, and governance space right now. And so the International Integrated Reporting Council has been subsumed into other organizations. But I'm still a big fan of this model because of the resource flow notion of it. And then this is a firm from South Africa called Vodacom, and just how they look at different forms of capital and convert them, and then the metrics that they use to track those. And the key takeaway here then is by using this type of social accounting, you are connecting your values to your strategy, your actions, and your metrics. So aligning everything in a pro-social active way. You're recognizing and accounting for your stakeholders' values, and considering value creation, not just in the short term, but also the medium and long term. And I won't go into this, but I'll provide afterwards a link. We did a project for what this could look like in a neighborhood through community well-being indicators, developing census data for each of the types of capitals. And here I wanted to speak to David's archipelago problem. The many islands of thoughts and practice that have related to this. I really see social accounting as an important step to bridging this archipelago. One, because you can see how many diverse disciplines are involved, right? Each of the capitals represents a whole knowledge domain, but sadly, those domains don't talk to each other. I also found that each of the sectors is very isolated and siloed. They use different languages. The business sector talks about capabilities, and nonprofit, we talk about capacity building, but they don't really talk to each other. It's like each has its function, but as far as the coordination, that doesn't happen too much. Social accounting is a framework that could translate across the micro, meso, and macro. And it promotes reciprocity and makes positive and negative externalities more visible. And I think if I had to be a little cynical, that's one reason it hasn't gotten taken up in the United States, is because it does make it clear who's making money through value creation and who's making money through value extraction. And then the opportunity, I'm interested in it from a strategy standpoint, is how can you use a social accounting framework to develop a pro-social business model? And so one of my students' favorite stories is this notion of how independent bookstores reinvented themselves in competition with Amazon. And Raffaele out of Harvard did this really great case study. He doesn't talk about social capital. He talks about connecting, convening, and curating. But it's basically developing social capital and intellectual capital to create this niche that Amazon could not compete with, as an example. And then here's, how I see the framework playing out across multiple levels. You could really use this at the individual level, such as career development or, job performance, growth opportunities, organizational for reporting, community well-being indicators, and then global and national. And then Mr. Pashone, I'll give you a shout out. So one of the interesting models I found who's using this is the Oakland Sheriff's Department is using this health vibrant community with a vital economy to talk about, how are they doing programming in their communities with the idea of crime reduction and enhanced well-being for its youth. And then here's a model to walk my talk. I'm really think, it's incumbent upon all of us to start thinking in multiple capitals and getting social accounting going in our own organization. So I just did this kind of mock-up for Arizona State University. It's been a little slow going to get it activated here, but I'm still trying. And then the other thing I see is just changes that need to happen with teaching and learning. So I teach, ASU allowed me to develop a course on all of this. My students really like it. It's been fascinating to see how their thinking shifts with this new framework. But the gaps that I see, where they don't know and why they're so rooted in, conventional notions of commerce, they don't understand complexity theory. So the idea of self-organization, emergence, and recursion, few have ever heard of them. And I just gave a presentation to an engineering group. They were not familiar with this either. So I think that's a thing. Systems thinking to understand the multiple levels and how resources flow across the level. Of course, evolutionary science principles to talk about, adaptation, selection, that kind of thing, niche construction. Natural capital, that's been one of my saddest things. I thought the younger generation would be more conversant in ecosystem services, and but they're not. Generally, it's a shock to them that nature provides services for us. So that's a gap. And then using capabilities, Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum's human development model as a policy approach. And I think the social accounting multiple capitals framework is a way to get us there. So that includes it. I just do want to encourage everybody to join the ProSocial Commons if you haven't either, and that way we can stay in touch and continue these great conversations.
Okay. So thank you very much. That was so much to talk about. If we could raise your hand, and we can form a queue by raising our hands, our virtual hands, and then so much to talk about. I'm not going to be the first, so I'm going to hold my tongue and let others go first. So who wants to be the first to to comment.
Hi, David.
Hello.
Hello, I'm very new here, and thank you very much, Gavin, for sending me the invitation. I really found the discussion very interesting, Elizabeth. I teach accounting. I am an associate professor at Sacred Heart University in Connecticut, and I also do research on sustainability and ESG. And the point that I could totally relate what you said, the traditional accounting does not capture the intangibles, right? If you have very reliable customers or very trained human resources, we don't capture those. And that's what we are talking about, integrated reporting. And compared to the EU countries, we are way behind. EU already adopted the standards, how to do integrated reporting. And it's not only your net income or balance sheet numbers, you also need to report all those numbers related how you are treating the community, the society, or even the environment. So here there are some problems here in the context of the United States. I want to say that we don't have any standards. How are we going to report those numbers in terms of comparability, how farms are doing? This is really very important. Our auditors are not trained how to audit those numbers. Anyone can do greenwashing, can put any numbers and any information that they're doing for climates or the sustainability or for their employees, suppliers. So that is one important thing that we need to think about. And another point, we are talking about carbon tax, where you will see the other parts of the world, they are imposing carbon tax. But here we are not taking that much initiatives. Another new concept is e-liabilities. It's environmental liabilities. It's not like we will put our accounts payable or the debt or loan that we owe. We also need to put those environmental liabilities on our balance sheet. For example, if you have scope 3 emissions, right? You are not directly emitting those, but you are outsourcing or through your suppliers, you are liable for those emissions, but we are not reporting those. So I think these are really important concepts from an accounting perspective. I can relate your presentation. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Mahusha. That really makes me, heartens me. I will, give a shout out to financial accounting. So that's the first thing we actually cover in the course, because it's been another shock to me how many people do not know, don't even track their own finances. And so we do introduce it. But then one of the exercises I go is like, okay, well, write down 3 things that you most value in your life. And then, well, how many of those show up on this balance sheet? And then like the light goes on, oh, maybe we're missing something here, right? So for comparability, I completely agree with you. And I know that's a work in progress. And I understand greenwashing is a thing and a potentially dangerous thing. And I think that's been one reason that there's been some pushback against ESG, but I would, caution not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I see this as a very nascent realm. I think about it actually as like parallel to when the third state of matter gases was discovered, just trying to experiment and see, what were the interactions between heat, temperature, and matter, that kind of thing. So I don't want to, I think we just need to keep working with it and the metrics will come. But the first thing is just to make it visible and realize that there's something there. These invisible resources are important. And then for your third point about the e-liability and scope 3 emissions, I will defer to you on that. I know it's important and there's a lot of talk about that in the ESG. I've seen price mechanisms, being as one of the proposed solutions. You just price things higher to account for those long-term effects, but that's a larger conversation, I think.
Michael.
Hello, thank you. Loved it. There were a whole range of things. I think from the world that I'm in, and that's a little bit kind of the economic / public policy / government side of the house. The things that most were like, oh, wow, that sounds really interesting. And And sometimes an idea is well established in one area and it just needs to migrate over. And so this is why I was particularly listening for specific types of indicators that could be used for particular. And I learned some things that I didn't expect to. So I just wanted to clap them up. The idea of that economically surplus, collaborative surplus rather than transaction costs is the way to start measuring and orienting seems absolutely, to me, it was a revelation. Love it. Strongly encourage you to, and if I could be an ally in helping you find ways to measure that, I think ProSocial, the intersubjectivity indicators of some of the work that we've done are some of the early state indicators, not complete visibility into that, but it could be the data collection here in the ProSocial community could be useful for that. And the other that kind of was like, wow, was something that I describe it as the treatment of error, that when you have a known process, every time an error comes up, you correct back to, that's what Lean Six Sigma is all about, fixing back to, and that you're saying variability is also the driver of innovation, productivity, and as like that whole question of conversations, and this could be a ProSocial conversation, when is variability error versus when is it the propeller of innovation is a huge thing. So I just wanted to kind of love, but I thought of your template, what was hard to kind of take to another area was one of the things where I see these kind of collaborative breakthroughs is when there is in fact proximity between the players. And you described that they were geographically co-located. Struggling, for example, in the ProSocial community to get collaboration across virtual spaces or across discipline is proving to be much more difficult because people can always jump. Whereas when people are kind of stuck with each other, they're my neighbors, and whether I like it or not. So I evolved the relational capital. And eventually from that relational soil comes these discovery of opportunity, but geography is a key constraint to the archipelago problem that you were talking about. And I'm wondering, are there cases where you're seeing virtual collaboration that is in fact breaking through not just to these levels of collective meta benefits? I'm struggling to find in the virtual spaces if there's this kind of transcendent mutualism that we're talking about. So again, I know that was a lot of talking. I just wanted to really clap it up and then throw a question out. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I really appreciate that. I hear what you're saying about the spatial. I totally agree. It is an advantage, right? To answer your question, there are some places. So virtual teams, for example, within organizations. And so Google, of all people or organizations, has done some really interesting research on what makes an effective team. And it's called Project Aristotle, if you Google that, and how psychological safety was such a key indicator on that. So I think there are templates. I mean, our group is sort of an experiment, right, for what the models look like. So that's evolving, and more research is needed.
Yeah, well, so much to say. I'm going to come in twice. I have kind of two big things I want to talk about. So great, Elizabeth, along with the others. And a lot that's new for me. I think there's evolution in complex systems, and so the complex systems part, and also the need to monitor. There's your CDP4, and monitoring at the systemic level of something like integrated reporting. And so the fact that that method exists, that it's already arisen, that it's already widely employed in things like airports and sheriff's departments, and I mean, that is like very provocative and shows you it's the good side of the archipelago. The bad side of the archipelago, of course, are these lack of communication, but the good side are all these natural experiments that take place and wonderful things that are just waiting to be discovered. And here's one of them. But I complex systems by their nature are somewhat unique, each and every one. And so if I were to try to develop some integrated reporting system it would have to be tailored to the context. And my question is that the case? Or is there something like that, a one size fits all? If you look at B Corp, for example, it's a little bit one size fits all. You kind of standard information, but I think that's problematic. And so how does integrated reporting, how do you develop a systemic reporting mechanism that's also contextual? That's my question.
Great question, David. And it really gets down to what Mafuja was asking, right, about this notion of comparability. And so if you think about that input transformation output model, which in the integrated reporting is called the octopus model, you can think about the front end, the inputs being more principles based, and then wanting to get to the comparability on the output side of it. And so the output side of it, that's where models such as a Global Reporting Initiative and SASB, Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, can be helpful because they focus on comparability, right? And that's what Wall Street wants, investors want. The problem that you raised, David, is that if you get too much into that standardization, then it's not adaptable to different contexts. And that's where, integrated reporting being more principles-based provides a conceptual framework, a strategic framework by which these capabilities can be developed and converted to get you to, the outputs that you're looking for.
I really like that answer. And it reminds me that Eleanor Ostrom, for the core design principles, made the very important point that there's the functional principle and its implementation. So the functional principles are general, monitoring, everyone needs to monitor. How you monitor, that's very contextual. There's a many-to-one relationship between a functional principle and its implementation. And when you said it was principles-based, I think that's what you were saying. There's something that you have to do functionally that's monitoring all these things, but its implementation has to be contextual. So, and so is that the case for integrated reporting? I mean, is that how it's developed?
It absolutely is. It is principles based, and it claims that, and that's one of the criticisms against it, is that it doesn't have standardized outcomes. And so it's usually used in tandem with another system, to get that comparability the investors are looking for. But yeah, and Eleanor Ostrom, that heartens me to know that it is very much like the core design principles, freedom within limits, right? And she's one of my heroes, so.
Yeah, great. Joseph.
Hey, I didn't really have a question. I just wanted to say that I appreciate you inviting me to listen to this. I see a lot of I saw a lot of parallels between. This was like a great case study to kind of tie in so many things that I've been learning about in class. And so I think it's incredible. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around everything. So the more opportunities I get to inundate myself with the material, I think is great. So it's awesome stuff. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Joseph. You might have noticed some of the slides look familiar from our project management class, the one on variability in particular, right? So,
yep.
So that's great. Glenn.
Hey, hi, Elizabeth. Thanks so much for your presentation. One thing that I was particularly interested in is how these groups became sustainable. Was it mostly from the member organizations that paid a membership dues? Did they fundraise jointly?
No, they did not fundraise jointly. That was the one area that they just couldn't get any traction on. Everybody was very territorial when it came to that with their donors. What they were able to do initially is they did have revenue membership dues, which came to about $125,000 a year. That provided some initial funding. And then they started attracting grants, like from the National Science Foundation and a couple of other federal and local agencies, regional. But it was through this shared membership model where they created this new enterprise, right? But that required so much trust because joining that shared model was a risk. because they were worried that the public would not buy individual organizational memberships anymore, so that their own revenue would take a hit, membership revenue. And it was only because of the trust and the cooperation, and then the very transparent and kind of cyclic method that they did to explore the shared membership opportunity. And I can send you more information about that, Glenn, if you're interested. But it was no developing a new product, basically, a collaborative product.
So they were outside members who wanted to join. They wanted to become a member of this whole Balboa Park organization, right? Is that it?
So there's two types of members. So they're the organizational or institutional members of the partnership, and those you had to be operating so many hours within the park. But then they developed for visitors. So just, if you lived in San Diego and you wanted to be able to go all the museums, then you could now buy a park-wide pass. They called it an Explorer Pass. Instead of before, I would have to buy one for the Natural History Museum and one for the Fleet Science Center. And what they were worried about is if they developed this park-wide pass, then nobody would buy the individual organizational memberships anymore. And there was some, churn where they did some of but the revenue that they got from the shared membership model made up for what they lost at the individual level. And we ran all those financial models because we didn't want to jeopardize our members' well-being either, our institutional members.
Great, thanks.
It's interesting that it took an external crisis to bring them together in the first place. And so often, war, natural disasters, that's what causes cooperation to take place at first. But then after they started, then it seems that brought them to some kind of plateau where they could collaborate in other ways once they worked out the mechanisms, is the way that I heard your story. So that was, one of the many interesting points. I just want to make a point on using nature as an example, and it's so fascinating, your own inquiry, Elizabeth. Our very next speaker is Tamsin Woolley Barker, who's very well known for biomimicry and teaming. She's our very next speaker on October 7. But a lot of work needs to be done, and it's great that so many people are starting to do it. But the one thing that you need to know about many natural systems is that they're like Balboa Park before those organizations got together, before, not after. I mean, nature is full of species that are evolved to function at cross purposes to each other, and you actually briefly alluded to that with parasitism. So, but if you look at an ecosystem, as Odom did, and you have an assumption that it's sufficient, or in any sense of the word, at the systemic level, often that's just not the case. It's like a dysfunctional human economy. It's what I call a CAS2 system, a complex system of agents following their respective adaptive strategies. So there's some ways in which we don't want to look for nature any more than you'd want to look at an unregulated human economy or a despotic human society. So you have to really, in both natural systems and human systems, you have to find what's worth emulating. And there's a lot of common denominators in why that is. So microbiomes, anything that's called an organism, a social insect colony, maybe forests. Actually, there's so much interest in forests as interconnected systems, maybe or maybe not. Microbiomes for sure, because you can really see that there's a selection taking place at the microbiome level. So it's still very much a work in progress. Let me pass to Gavin, and then maybe I'll jump back in, but that's one of the points I wanted to make.
I really enjoyed the talking about variability, and because I come from a manufacturing background, so and I was constantly battling with the quality assurance department and other groups in the company that wanted to keep everything on the straight and narrow, and I was like, yeah, but then we're never going to learn anything new. So, we would then, try to create opportunities for experiments. And then once we had discovered new things and better ways to run stuff and whatever, then, the quality people would immediately want to lock it in. So you sort of have this like plan, do, check, act, and then, wheel kind of going up a ramp vision, and then you jam a wedge in underneath it so you can't go, back downhill. But I was always constantly, like, okay, yeah, we got that nailed down. Tomorrow I want to try a different thing. And they'd be like, no, you can't, and then sometimes things would just go off the rails, not intentionally. And you could actually discover some really interesting things when they did. So you take advantage of that. The other thing I really loved about this was the collaboration between the organizations, because I tend to be naturally very, pro-social, altruistic, or whatever our conscious capitalism group is working, friendly with, B Corp organizations and passive house groups and things like that in our, in our region. And, we just do nice things and help each other out. But this is making me think like, wow, we could be a lot more intentional about this, and a lot more intentional about creating all kinds of different value as we work together. And just, all the, the relationship values, the social values, the political, value that we could all be generating if we work together more intentionally. So I really appreciate that. I think that's great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Gavin. It is, I think, just putting these different types of capitals on people's radar screens is a huge game changer, because like once you see the capitals, you see it everywhere. It's hard to unsee it, right? But until you see it, you don't really take it for granted, or you can't really activate it or do anything with it.
This is what CDPH should be. I mean, it's what it is. It's appropriate relations among other groups. And I think that's so the whole point of this, and what we're developing, and it's currently our best example is in Latin America, our Latin America project. But it's much more general than that. That once an organization starts working on this and they've internalized it for their own organization, then it automatically, I think, goes, who do we depend on? What's our ecosystem? How can we actually work with those other organizations? We already are working with some of them. How can we spread this to them, and so on? And it could propagate up the thing. And that's what your virtuous spiral was, Elizabeth. Something that your wonderful example reminds me, but it's an example of, is that, of course, anything that happens is an example of cultural evolution. But of course, it's not explicitly conceptualized in that way. And even when we study it historically, as you did for your PhD thesis, then it's not explicitly from a multi-level cultural evolutionary. How could it be? Because you didn't, that's all so very recent. And I think that one of the things we're trying to do, it's a major priority for us, is currently we're kind of working in the present and the future. We're working with organizations in the present, and we're trying to assist in their cultural evolution into the future. But we could also turn that same perspective towards their past, and that we could actually use our theoretical framework and to do a kind of a special kind of history that is more explicitly from a cultural evolutionary perspective, and also is scientific, because you can do science on the past. You cannot do experiments in the past, but there's very much a way to approach the past scientifically. That's what paleontology is, and there's branches of human history, historical study that's doing that. And so I think that we want to develop that capacity. We are, and this would be a case, a lovely case, that this Balboa Park story, which I've described in the chat as a cultural major transition. It's what it is. I mean, we have entities that were functioning at their organizational level, and then there was a meta-organizational level that they started to function as. And one thing about major evolutionary transitions is it's like a ratchet mechanism, or at least it can be. after it happens, you don't go back, or it's hard to go back. The dependency becomes great enough that you almost become addicted to the cooperation, and you can't depart from it anymore. You've offloaded many of your functions to other parts of the system, and so there's a very like ratchet-like mechanism that that takes place that in both biological systems and in human systems. So it's also very interesting. Okay. Yes, Elizabeth, please comment.
Oh, no, I'm just going to say that that's super interesting. I hadn't thought about it like that, but I think about it. Yeah, the benefits that you get out of a collaboration, it would be hard to give those up, right? And the other thing I would say is just there was also this very human dimension of it that people really enjoy being involved in the program, the partnerships programs. And so, you know, they used Maslow's hierarchy to talk about, you know, personal development, and it just helped create a more engaging and meaningful experience.
Yeah, so well, what do you think could be done within the ProSocial Commons, Elizabeth, or any one of us, to advance this? I think for one thing, we have our economics and business. Now I feel like renaming that economics, business, and nonprofit discussion circle. But what do you think, or anyone else think that that we could be doing with this? And I'll extend that to the conscious capitalism groups, because we're starting to work very closely with the conscious capitalism movement, and so I think that we can think along those lines too.
Well, for me, just using the framework to make sense of some of the conscious capitalism cases, I think would be super interesting.
Right, right. Michael. Oh, and Kathleen. Kathleen is there's Kathleen and Glenn. Great.
Michael, would you mind if I went before you, just because my statement
please
follows right from what Elizabeth just said. Elizabeth, this was just fascinating. It was so comprehensive and so well thought out. It very powerful, and that's what I was thinking. How can we apply the ProSocial framework, which is, you know, it seems simple, but those principles to actual case studies that are using, you know, these ideas. That's I think that would be really a wonderful challenge for us to do. You mentioned the need to develop linguistic capital, and I want to say that I think the fact that you are talking about these different types of capital in such a clear way, that's part of what helps people internalize the framework. And the more people internalize it, the easier it'll be for people to start talking about it, like your students. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Great, that's so great. I'm so happy to have had this, to have provided this opportunity. Michael and Glenn.
Oops, I meant to lower my hand.
Yeah, a thought and a skeptical remark. So I was offering that that the intersubjectivity and what I was calling using the ACT table or even the CDPs as a measurement of collaborative fitness is an early indicator potentially of collaborative efficiency at certain levels, and that it's certainly making it easier for folks to self-diagnose using the ACT table and or the CDPs can, in fact, it does seem to have some predictive value. But a lot of what I was hearing in the framework actually were historical monitoring rather than predictive. And I just wondered, are there things you're seeing that really data that when this is captured, and to give an example of contrasting, you know, a lot of measures around environment could be acres of lumber. And in a different discipline, biodiversity indicators are an indicator of the fitness of a system, but they're not used by corporations. They don't track that. They don't usually care. They try not to report against it because it doesn't make them look good. And so these indicator frameworks, sometimes you have to look at, are these just historical reporting, or are they really predictive of something that is meaningful? And I wondered, what in the systems that you've presented to us have that kind of predictive capability that people who are doing this part are in fact 20% of the time more reliably hitting that mark? And that's a tough question. If the answer is don't, I'm sorry I asked it. Just
No,
thought I had to go there.
I appreciate it. It's a good question, and one I need to be thinking about. So thank you for stimulating that. I haven't really done a lot of work in the predictive thing. I think it is just, we first have to all get the lay of the land, the descriptive model, before we get to prescriptive. But I do have seen some research in the ESG space, and maybe Mafuja could talk about that a little bit, as where they're looking at an analysis of firms that have more pro-social orientation. What are their financial returns, right? And so that's the only kind of predictive stuff I've seen in this realm.
Great, thank you, Glenn. And then we'll end with a quick round. And so,
Okay.
So go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, looking at the applicability of what Elizabeth was talking about in terms of the pro-social commons, how we can possibly apply that. And I see the first step with the Balboa Park is that representatives from each organization started coming together, even though they didn't actually figure out anything to do, but at least they had contact. So I would think that for the pro-social commons, if we can invite representatives from other organizations, so they're not just an individual on Zoom, but they're also they're representatives of another organization, so they can take back, something that what we're doing, and then other organizations start learning what we're doing, and maybe the creative juices can start flowing about how we can collaborate.
That's great, Glenn. It's something we're doing at the level of pro-social world to some extent, but and so within pro-social commons too. But I couldn't agree more. Basically, I actually made the point in chat that a framework for ongoing interactions is like essential. You have to be meeting periodically, and when we're doing that, let's meet at multiple levels. So let's meet, and so our method of individuals in teams representing organizations that expect to work with each other is, I think, what you're talking about. And so we're trying to do that pro-social worldwide. Doing that within pro-social commons, that's really interesting to think about. I'll need to do some more thinking about that. Let me call on people just to have a final checkout as we wind up. So Randy, would you like to just to say a little word in closing?
I don't really have much to contribute, but I was very struck by the discussion of interdependence of a forest. I'm still, even though I'm retired, I'm doing a lot of work with the homeless and the mentally ill. And I'm seeing a lot of policy generation at the legislature and other places of painting a broad brush to solve a problem without really drilling down into what is happening in each specific geographical area, each homeless camp for that matter. I think the forest model is something I can certainly use, and I thank you for that. So,
yeah, and Randy, I think one of our speakers is going to be Roseanne Haggerty, who works on the homeless, and her organization, Community Solutions, just won the MacArthur Foundation's $100 million grant for, and so that's amazing. And she does just what you said. They track individuals. I mean, it's an amazing story, and I look forward to featuring it. So, I hope that you remain a member of our community, because the homelessness is one of our objectives. Mafuja, could you say something in closing?
It's my first meeting here. I just want to say thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very much interested. I also do empirical research. I mostly collect large US farms data, and what Elizabeth mentioned, that it's kind of predictive, and my research showed that how farms can get benefit through these ESG investments. And I'd be very happy to share some of my research findings and some of my projects that I am working now. And I know it would be really interesting to see some small and mid-sized local farms perspective or not-for-profit perspective if I get data. That's how I'm trained, just to do like empirical and econometrics research. But thank you very much, David. Thank you.
All right. We'll definitely provide a forum for you. So we'll definitely do that. And Gavin.
Yeah, I love the whole idea of, you know, as companies implement conscious capitalism or pro-social principles to, you know, in the past, all we've really thought to do is just talk about, you know, yes, they're better and people are happier, but, you know, and they do financially better and everything. But I think it'd be fantastic to actually measure all of these things, not only within those companies themselves, but also within their ecosystem, the network of the companies, and how much extra, you know, value, if you want to call it, you know, that's created, you know, by that behavior, and how much wealthier they are in all those aspects, because they'll way outperform the other companies if we measure all of these metrics.
Yeah, I'd like to think that even though we're late adopters for integrated reporting, just in my case, just finding out about it, that we could actually kind of rush to the head of the class. Maybe that's how arrogant I am, and that we would have an opportunity to do so. And I think in our conversations, Gavin, for how do we engage with corporations and so on, as we're sort of casting about for the best way to do that, bringing in this integrated reporting would be maybe something, you know, really pretty ambitious that we could do, and we wouldn't have to invent it. We could improve it maybe, or maybe not even that. But so I think let's definitely put that into our conversations moving forward. Kathleen.
Well, gosh, this has been so thought-provoking. I was just thinking about how this presentation has fit into so many things that have captured my interest and I've studied over the years, going back to learning about subjective well-being, measurement devices, and how they began to be applied to comparing societies, you know, different countries, how good people were feeling in terms of that metric compared to the gross national product. And then there was a shift away from gross national product to more integrative measurements regarding how people are doing. And then there's Rian Eisler's work. She was talking about cultural and social capital 25 years ago, in talking about the work of housewives and other people that contribute to society. So this is just such a rich a structuring of more science-based frameworks that can be now that it can be applied to organizations is very, very exciting. And I do think that there can be parallel work done with the outlying community using things like subjective well-being measurements that can discuss, well, how are the people in the neighborhood feeling, or how are the people that are members feeling, you know, about social contribution, because there has to be a lot of other hidden value that's happening.
Okay, well, this is clarifying, crystallizing for me that one thing we could do, and the pro-social commons could do, along with conscious capitalism, is let's find one or more contexts for implementing the integrated reporting framework. And it might be a neighborhood, it might be a business, it might be, let's look, first of all, learn more about it. So I think a learning journey about integrated reporting leading to its implementation in some context, I think would be a great thing to do. And we could get a group to do that. There would be an action group, I think would probably be, you know, we'd have an 8-week cycle. And I think that would be cool. So should have thought of that before. So anyway, all so good. So Joseph.
I'm here. I mean, sorry, I'm trying to multitask. I got too much homework this weekend.
No, that's very great. Any closing thought other than thank you for joining us? But I'm sure that Elizabeth is lucky to have a student like you.
Oh, and it's likewise. Yeah, I'm just grateful for the opportunity, and look forward to being here for the next lecture for sure.
Okay, awesome. Okay, Michael.
I wanted to first say thank you to both of you, Elizabeth and Dave. If well-being is the Santa Monica and Amsterdam both have some very interesting things going on in that space. But when David, you said an interesting learning sprint, Bill Bowie's work on the framework is at the forefront. And what we could play very well into that is this idea of how does collaborative behavior accelerate the transformational thresholds, the achievement or the evolution or the refinement or crystallization or something, move the needle on the thresholds of transformation.
Yeah. I mean, any of these bioregional regenerative culture projects would be a great platform for that. So yeah. Glenn, I think you're the last one if I'm doing my accounting right. Oh, Juliet, of course, Juliet. We're going to round up with Juliet, but Glenn.
Yeah, so two main things I walk away with. I'm appreciative of Elizabeth giving the presentation. So that's really great. Thanks again, Elizabeth. And also the metaphor of the tree that dropping the leaves and that's affecting the environment and it's making it better for the tree. So I thought that was a great metaphor to think about in terms of how pro-social commons can improve our environment, for us all.
Yeah, thank you. That's also called niche construction, which is not a very elegant term, but no, but the idea that we're creating this inner and outer, basically, creating our social environment and creating our inner thoughts and so you call it symbolic capital, language capital, and so on. Joseph, did you raise your hand?
Yes, sir. Sorry, I just wanted to say. So right now I'm finishing up a master's in space studies and beginning a master's in project management, through which Doctor is my professor for a class right now. So I'm definitely interested in the sustainable use or sustainable development of space, the use of space as a global or cosmic commons. I know that there's been some back and forth on how we should go about taking ownership of celestial resources, space mining. I know there's some people that think, well, we should focus more on the one planet that sustains life versus spending resources on, chasing after dreams for Mars. But I definitely think, at least Earth orbits are just GPS capabilities alone have changed the world. So, space is definitely something that is going to be probably even more developed in the future. And it's up to us to decide what that future is going to look like, or else we're going to we could end up in a future that we don't necessarily actively choose. So I think that this, everything that you guys have been talking about can also find a way in that direction as well. So that's something I definitely like to explore personally.
Thanks for bringing that up. And I'll say two things about it. I just put in the chat, the main society for Elinor Ostrom Commons Study. It's called the International Association for the Study of the Commons. Look it up on the web. And right there on their website, they're doing a workshop on the space commons. So cool. You've got some kindred spirits there. And then one of our supporters, Claudia Weiss, is also interested in the space economics. And so I think that keep in touch, Joseph, and I'll keep in touch with you through Elizabeth. And we can offer just, well, there's some just resource sharing, another reason to get together. You know, this what kind of capital is that, Elizabeth, on all your little commons badges? Which one is the kind of knowledge swapping that we just did just now?
Intellectual capital, and then cultural capital, developing new norms, and social capital, strengthening our relationships.
Okay. I want badges. I want a big Cub Scout sash with all of these. Okay, Juliet, you're the last.
Sure. We'll get working on those badges, maybe some trophies, sashes. Yeah, I think it's extremely striking how widely the same framework can be applied to so many different perspectives, and with the data to back it up as well. And I'll just end with thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for everyone that was able to attend today.
And thanks to Juliet, who's is behind a lot that goes on. Is thanks to Juliet. So all good, everyone. All good until next time. In just a little while, this will be taking place every week. So thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Thanks, Elizabeth.